Hong Kong, once a beacon of wealth and a bustling port of trade, became fire, rage, and death. This is democracy gone wrong. American history is dotted with the fight for civil rights. With the Emancipation Proclamation, this fight took a step towards greater equality. The reason why thousands and thousands of immigrants poured into the United States was because of the new life one could live, with freedom of choice, speech, and more. Millions believed in these democratic rights and ideals. Hong Kong is one place where millions believed in similar values. When Communist China grew into a powerful nation, the original British colony of Hong Kong kept its partial autonomy and democratic features. Due to the British style of education in Hong Kong, citizens were taught traditional British values of independence and liberty. This created a contrast of ideals between them and their counterparts in mainland China. However, in 1997, Hong Kong was officially handed over to China, while getting 50 years to maintain autonomy. China and Hong Kong held the concept of one country, two systems. This meant that Hong Kong had autonomy in all areas except for foreign relations and defense. However, this arrangement is set to expire in 2047, and it is unknown what will happen to Hong Kong after that.
Any attempt to have increased the pace of democracy back in the 60s, 70s, 80s was always attacked by the Chinese leadership because they said to Britain, look, this isn't at one of your other colonies, this isn't Singapore or Malaysia. You're not preparing the country for democracy and then handing it back for its for independence. You're handing it over to China because you've only got it on a 99-year lease, at least most of it. So there was always hostility from China about any democratic development.
To research the impact of the 2019 Hong Kong protests on the people involved, we've interviewed a student who took part in the Hong Kong protests. Due to the actions taken, this interviewee wishes to remain anonymous.
Yeah, so I guess I can introduce myself as well. My name's I'm actually studying not really anything like socially or political. I'm just like from Hong Kong, but I'm studying, and yeah, I moved here from Hong Kong about like years ago for university, and also, well, part of the reason is to like escape, but also like for university is the main reason, I guess. So yeah, that's why I'm here.
Throughout the years, citizens of Hong Kong have found their democratic ideals slowly being confined. The rise of the extradition bill, a bill that allows China to detain and transfer people wanted in countries and territories, caused a sudden spur of protesters. Though the bill was meant to stop criminals from hiding in different regions, protesters saw this as a way to dampen their individual right to jury, seeing it as a loophole for the government to deport anyone to mainland China.
And also, there's another key motivation, which is, so first of all, it's like the universal suffrage thing that they don't get to nominate their own chief executive. I mean, secondly, would be the extradition law, which was imposed. So if you look it up, like this extradition law would allow people from Hong Kong to get extradited to mainland China for like to go through their judicial process instead of Hong Kong's, which is really worrying because before we had like owners, most notably there was a Causeway bookstore who sells like political books in a place called Causeway Bay, and their boss was like, the bookstore owner was arrested and sent to China before. Like this was definitely illegal, and now that they want to do this legally with this extradition law, just infuriated a lot of people.
咁我覺得香港就需要成立呢個獨立調查委員會咧，嚟調查警察係咪濫捕，從而可以挽回翻我哋喺以前香港有嗰個人權嗰個狀況。
But what started all of this? In 1841, the British established Hong Kong as a crown colony. China lost all sovereignty and power after the Opium Wars, and it wasn't until the rise of the Communist Party that China regained its relative power in the region. Ever since, China has been looking to regain its former status and land holdings, including Hong Kong. In a sense, Hong Kong was stranded and surrounded by pressuring socialistic ideals of communism. China, in order to maintain the legality of capitalism in communist China, established the one country, two systems. This was done to ensure unity in the country and to avoid political strife within the country. Fear of this ongoing pressure and removal of the capitalist and democratic traditions from this area has always been a fear for the Hong Kong residents.
Can you provide an overview of what motivated the protest?
So before the 2019 protests, there were actually, I think sometimes people miss out on this, but what really led to it's sort of domino effects. You have the 2014 protests, you have the fishbowl revolution. If you haven't learned about this, it's okay. But it's before we had a series of protests, whereas before 2014 it was really just peaceful and no one really said a thing. And then we started the first thing, which is the umbrella revolution. So that's what really caused people's attentions, and people started to be aware, more political aware, and started to aware that their rights are starting to get stripped away, and that they didn't really have a choice in choosing a chief executive, and that people realized that the Hong Kong government, or mainly the Chinese central government, is starting to step over the line, and that they think that this is not what the British handover agreed on. They agreed on high degree of autonomy, and this caused a lot of dispute.
The introduction of the extradition bill seriously amplified these sentiments, and soon hundreds of thousands of people began to protest, peacefully and violently. Pro-protesters wanted to achieve more political power and defended the right to speech, while pro-China argued that the use of violence, arson, and mob mentality made the protesters criminals regardless of intent. In fact, the democratic ideals were broken as policemen arrested rioters on sight, despite no evidence. Pro-protesters argued that the use of violence was necessary to gain attention, while pro-China countered that the safety of citizens came before rights.
So how exactly did you guys protest? Did you go to so you separated into maybe groups to different locations and then go to a specific location, and are you just holding up signs calling for change, or what?
So I guess during the protest there are two main groups of people. There's people who are peaceful and people who are, what they call them is violent, and inside the protesting community. So the peaceful community would come out to peacefully protest, hold signs, or just hold signs and chant slogans mainly, and have a planned route. And they communicate this through Telegram. And there's also the violent groups, which are the more violent ones. They have Molotov cocktails, or they would hold road signs as shields, for example, and or even stand in the front lines to hold umbrellas to basically get the tear gas away from the peaceful crowds. So those are considered the violent, and most of those peoples are divided into small groups where they all use alias names so people can identify them, and they would all separate out, communicate through Telegram and separate out to different regions.
Hong Kong has been a huge financial hub. In fact, Hong Kong has been the largest global offshore RMB foreign exchange market, with an average turnover of 107.6 billion as of April 2019, which is considerably higher than the 56.7 billion for London and 42.6 billion for Singapore. The capitalist economy of Hong Kong has been booming. In 1987, Hong Kong had a per capita income of $8,260. Just a few miles away in communist China, the per capita income was only $300. The reason for this was the free market economics and the limited government. Throughout most of its history, Hong Kong has had no tariffs or other restraints on international trade. It had no minimum wage laws, no fixing of prices, and no capital gains taxes. As a result of these laissez-faire policies established by the British, Hong Kong has flourished. With many years of living under these forms of laissez-faire policies, the Hong Kong people, just like the colonists, were used to enjoying the freedom similar to salutary neglect. However, the Chinese nationalist perspective pushes for a political agenda that prioritizes one country before two systems. The 2019 Hong Kong protests showed that the political movements in Hong Kong represented people's striving efforts to preserve a unique Hong Kong heritage, its collective memory, and political consciousness. In order to preserve these traits, the protesters demanded 5 key requests. Number 1, withdraw the extradition bill. Number 2, stop labeling the protesters as rioters. Number 3, drop charges against protesters. Number 4, to conduct an independent inquiry into police behavior. And number 5, to implement free elections for a chief executive. In Hong Kong's eyes, without the fulfillment of these democratic requests, it would be impossible to fully return to peace. Hong Kong Governor Carrie Lam, under pressure, slowly withdrew the extradition bill, but stopped negotiations after protesters stormed the Legislative Council complex with violent methods on July 1st. A famous activist, Joshua Wong, was a student protester who was one of the key protesters who led and motivated others to demonstrate for democracy. Amnesty International's Asia-Pacific Regional Director Yamini Mishra said that as a result, the government used the politically motivated charge of inciting others to protest to prosecute people who have merely spoken out and protested peacefully. With this charge, Wong was soon arrested and jailed. His political party was also soon disbanded. There was not a serious global impact from the Hong Kong protests. While Americans on Twitter did actively support the pro-democracy protesters, many others decided not to anger China, since China has a known low tolerance level for disagreement and criticism. Any nations or corporations that trade with China have mostly decided to keep out of the affairs in order to maintain trade and profit. While Donald Trump actively promised Chinese President Xi Jinping that the US would remain silent on the protests, rallies have taken place in New York and Washington. During June, there were 39 other planned protests that took place around the world. Additionally, all the social media support has amplified the protests internationally. While these ideals seem similar to American ideals, it's important to remember that the people from Hong Kong were born and educated with these ideals. The US may have influenced these ideals, but the primary support of the US came from social media, not through direct involvement.
So, do you think, maybe, if not for you, or at least for others, do you think maybe like the ideals within the US Constitution may have affected, the way that people really protested? Or like why they protested?
As in like these ideals. I guess it's more or less like not from the U.S. Constitution, but more like these are just ideas that were already instilled in us in our education as well, because we were taught on the Hong Kong Basic Law, which guaranteed us those rights. So it's not directly from the U.S. Constitution, I guess, but those ideas hold staying in the Hong Kong Basic Law, and people definitely have those beliefs, and that they started to realize that they're like, hey, like, this doesn't really seem like the way it should be. Like, there isn't really free flow of information anymore, and there's freedom assembly list in the law, but now we need, like, there's a sort of, like, you need the police department's agreement in order to hold a protest. So, like, what is really going on? Like, we're supposed to have the right to protest at any time, right? So there's sort of people starting to question their freedoms, I guess. So these freedoms were already existing in Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong government, it's in the Hong Kong law. So these are indisputable facts, but the Hong Kong government started to, like, refuse to recognize these rights.
So continuing along the idea of international tension, do you know of any specific, like, American support that America showed, whether through social media or something else?
I think Americans, like, for the American public, they really, like, voiced out during, like, in Twitter, for example. I think they voiced out most in Twitter that they're in support and they offered like help, and actually some even like some American Hong Kongers who are like second generation or such shipped, like for example, like mass supplies for tear gas back to Hong Kong. So I guess like in a way those Hong Kongers that are technically American help the Hong Kongers in Hong Kong as well. And I think when I was in Hong Kong, the most like the way I think America perceived like Hong Kong mainly came from like its government speaking body, because I think that shows that they're caring about this issue, or sometimes when they're trying to avoid the issue, you know that they're not really like committed to supporting Hong Kong all the way sometimes. So you can sort of, I guess my view of America is more on its like government and what they can offer to do to help us. But yeah, I think, but in terms of public opinion, it's clearly reflected in Twitter, I think.
However, the US encouragement definitely created conflicts in the geopolitical relationship between China and the US. Similar concerns for Taiwan led to a worsening of cooperation and understanding that hurt both sides.
So as in whether these protests worsen the relationship between China and US?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, definitely. This is like a no-brainer, because we can see that the US, well, the US definitely has this sort of motivation to like promote the Hong Kong protest as well. Like for example, the US and China already did not have like a good relationship to start with, but it worsened it in a way such that the US was using Hong Kong as a way to say like, hey China, you don't really have democracy over there, and China is kind of like really trying to suppress these protests, and it's just trying to like things really escalated from them. And I think the US embassy also, like for example, they started, before they really never did this, but they started lighting up candles on June 4th. So I guess there's a way that the US tried to make use of the fact, and Hong Kongers definitely welcomed their support, but we were also very aware that like we don't want to be manipulated, I guess. But in terms of the high level relations, yes, definitely. Like China definitely thinks that there's foreign interference in the protests as well, which I disagree with, because I personally experienced the protest and I wasn't like funded by the US government or whatever. But yeah, their difference in beliefs definitely exaggerated after the protest.